Imagine waking up on an ordinary morning in 1850, feeling something different. Not the kind of different you shake off with a glass of water. The kind that makes your stomach drop before your brain even understands why. Your throat feels wrong. Your muscles ache in a way that doesn't feel like tiredness. And as you try to sit up, you notice the bed next to yours is empty. Because the person who slept there died last week. Not in a war. Not in an accident. They simply got sick. And the doctor who came to your house didn't just fail to help. He made everything worse. This is not fiction. This was Tuesday. In 1850, the average life expectancy in the United States hovered around 38 years. Not because people were weak, not because life was short by design, but because the invisible world, the world of bacteria, viruses, and pathogens that surrounded every single person every single day, was completely misunderstood. Doctors had no idea what was actually killing their patients, and that ignorance wasn't just dangerous, it was lethal on an industrial scale. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The most terrifying diseases of 1850 didn't kill slowly. They didn't give you time to say goodbye. Cholera could take a healthy adult from first symptom to death in less than 24 hours. Typhoid fever crept through water supplies silently, infecting entire neighborhoods before a single person realized what was happening. Tuberculosis, called consumption at the time, was so common that people romanticized it. Writers described the pale, thin appearance of dying patients as beautiful, as poetic, because they had no other way to process something that was killing 1 in 4 people across Europe and America. But here is what nobody talks about. The danger in 1850 wasn't just the diseases themselves. It was everything humans were doing to accidentally make them worse. The treatments, the habits, the complete and total confidence that doctors had in methods that were, without exaggeration, killing the patients they were trying to save. Bloodletting was still standard practice. Mercury was prescribed as medicine. Surgeons operated without washing their hands, not out of laziness, but because the concept of germs didn't exist yet in mainstream medicine. You think you would have survived 1850? Most people do. But the question isn't whether you're tough enough. The question is whether you would have survived the cure. Let's start with the disease that turned cities into graveyards almost overnight: cholera. If you want to understand just how unprepared 1850 was for what was coming, cholera is your answer. By the time the third major cholera pandemic swept through the United States in 1852, entire city blocks were being emptied. Not over months, but over days. New Orleans lost nearly 8,000 people in a single summer. New York watched thousands die, while city officials argued about whether to even acknowledge the outbreak publicly, because admitting there was a cholera epidemic was bad for business. Here's what cholera actually does to the human body. And pay attention, because this is where the story gets medically brutal. The bacterium responsible, Vibrio cholerae, attacks the lining of your small intestine and essentially forces your body to expel every fluid it has. The diarrhea produced is not normal. It is described by physicians of the era as rice water discharge. Pale, odorless, and relentless. A person could lose 1 liter of fluid per hour. Within hours, the dehydration becomes so severe that the skin loses its elasticity, the eyes sink into the skull, and the muscles begin to cramp violently. The skin turns bluish. Patients were sometimes described as looking already dead while they were still conscious. And the treatment? Doctors gave opium to slow the digestive system. They administered calomel, which is a mercury compound, to purge the body further. Some physicians bled their patients, draining blood from people who were already dangerously dehydrated. Every single one of these interventions accelerated death. The cure was, in the most literal sense, worse than the disease, but cholera, as terrifying as it was, had competition. Typhoid fever was arguably more insidious because it was invisible in a way cholera wasn't. Cholera killed fast and dramatically. Typhoid was patient. It contaminated water supplies silently, spreading through the same wells and rivers that people drank from every single day. The symptoms started subtle. A mild fever, a headache, fatigue that felt like a heavy blanket you couldn't shake off. By the time the characteristic rose-colored spots appeared on the abdomen, the infection had already been in the body for 1 to 3 weeks. The patient had already infected everyone around them without knowing it. In 1850, no American city had a functioning sewage system that was separated from its drinking water supply. Human waste and drinking water shared the same infrastructure in ways that today would be considered criminally negligent. But in 1850, nobody made the connection. The brilliant and tragic irony is that the physician who first proposed that contaminated water was spreading cholera, a man named John Snow, was largely dismissed by the medical establishment for years. The idea that something you couldn't see, something invisible in perfectly clear water, could be killing thousands of people. It was simply too strange to accept. This is the part of 1850 that doesn't get talked about enough. The enemy wasn't just disease. The enemy was certainty. The absolute, unshakable confidence of educated men who were completely wrong. If cholera was the executioner and typhoid was the silent assassin, then tuberculosis was something far more disturbing. It was the disease that 1850 learned to live with, and that acceptance, that quiet normalization of mass death, might be the darkest thing about the entire era. By the middle of the 19th century, tuberculosis was responsible for roughly 1 in 4 deaths across the Western world. 1 in 4. Think about every group of people you know, your family, your coworkers, your closest friends. In 1850, statistically, 1 of them would be consumed by this disease. Not killed quickly, consumed slowly. Over months or years, the body would waste away from the inside, the lungs filling with bacterial colonies that slowly destroyed the tissue around them. Patients coughed constantly. They coughed blood. They lost weight until their bodies looked like architecture, all sharp angles and hollow spaces. Their skin became translucent. Their eyes became unnaturally bright from the fever that never fully left. And here is where the story takes a turn that should genuinely disturb you. Victorian society didn't just accept tuberculosis. In certain circles, they romanticized it. The pale, fragile appearance of tuberculosis patients was considered aesthetically beautiful. Poets wrote about it. Artists painted it. Lord Byron allegedly said he wished he could die of consumption because of how poetic it looked. Women used cosmetics to artificially recreate the hollow-cheeked, translucent-skinned appearance of the dying because it was fashionable. A society was so surrounded by this particular death that it rewired its sense of beauty around the symptoms of a bacterial infection destroying human lungs. But while tuberculosis was being romanticized in parlors and poetry collections, the medical response to it was catastrophically misguided. The dominant theory at the time held that tuberculosis was hereditary, not contagious. This single misconception had consequences that are almost impossible to overstate. Because if the disease was inherited rather than transmitted, there was no reason to isolate patients, no reason to avoid sharing cups, utensils, or sleeping spaces with the infected. Families crowded together in small, poorly ventilated rooms, exactly the conditions that allowed the airborne bacterium to spread with devastating efficiency. And medicine told them this was perfectly safe. The treatments prescribed were, by any modern standard, a horror show. Patients were sent to sanatoriums in mountain regions under the theory that cold, fresh air would slow the disease. Some improved slightly, largely because the isolation accidentally reduced reinfection rates. But others were subjected to collapse therapy, a procedure where physicians deliberately collapsed one of the patient's lungs by injecting air into the chest cavity on the theory that resting the lung would allow it to heal. The procedure caused excruciating pain, frequent complications, and in many cases, accelerated death. It was performed with complete confidence for decades, and underneath all of it, underneath the romanticization and the misdiagnosis and the lethal treatments, was a simple and terrible truth that nobody in 1850 had access to. The bacterium responsible, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, had been living inside human populations for thousands of years. It was ancient, it was patient, and it was extraordinarily good at surviving in exactly the environments that 19th century poverty and urbanization were creating at an unprecedented scale. Overcrowded tenements, factories with no ventilation, children working 12-hour days in enclosed spaces alongside adults who were already infected. The disease didn't just exploit the biology of its hosts, it exploited the economics, the poverty, the architecture, the ignorance. Every single structural failure of 1850 society became a vector, and the people dying weren't just unlucky. They were trapped inside a system that had no tools, no framework, and no language to even describe what was actually happening to them. Here is the question you've been carrying since the first sentence. Would you have survived 1850? And the honest answer, the one that most people don't want to sit with, is that survival had very little to do with personal strength. It had almost everything to do with luck, geography, and whether the doctor who showed up at your door was the kind of man who washed his hands. Because by 1850, the single most dangerous place you could be when sick was not your home, it was the hospital. The mortality rate for patients admitted to major urban hospitals in the United States and Europe during this period was staggering. Infections acquired inside the hospital, what we now call nosocomial infections, killed patients who had arrived with survival conditions. A man could walk into a hospital with a broken leg and leave in a coffin, dead from a surgical infection that had nothing to do with his original injury. This wasn't rare. This was expected. Surgeons moved from patient to patient, from autopsy tables to operating rooms, without changing clothes or cleaning instruments. The same unwashed hands that had just explored a gangrenous wound would perform your surgery minutes later. The physician who finally cracked this problem was a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, working in a Vienna maternity ward in the 1840s. He noticed that women delivering babies in the ward staffed by medical students who also performed autopsies, were dying at 5 times the rate of women in the midwife-staffed ward. He proposed a solution so simple, it should have been celebrated immediately. Wash your hands with a chlorinated lime solution before touching patients. Mortality in his ward dropped from roughly 18% to under 2% almost overnight. The data was unambiguous. The results were undeniable. But here is the tragedy. The medical establishment destroyed him for it. His colleagues were offended by the implication that doctors, educated gentlemen, could be the source of disease transmission. The idea was considered an attack on their professional dignity. Semmelweis was ridiculed, dismissed from his position, and eventually committed to a mental institution. He died there in 1865, at 47 years old. Almost certainly from the same type of infection he had spent his career trying to prevent. The wound on his hand became infected after his admission. The irony is so precise. It feels constructed, but it wasn't. It was just 1850 being exactly what it was. And this is the thing that makes 1850 genuinely terrifying in a way that no horror story can fully replicate. It wasn't the diseases alone. It was the gap between what was knowable and what was known. The tools to save lives existed. The observations had been made. The data was sitting right there, waiting to be accepted. But the cultural machinery of the era, the professional hierarchies, the class structures, the deep human resistance to being told that everything you believed was wrong. That machinery crushed the truth before it could spread. So would you have survived? Maybe. If you were wealthy enough to avoid overcrowded tenements. If you were lucky enough to live far from a contaminated water source. If you were unfortunate enough to need a doctor, but fortunate enough to never actually see one. The survivors of 1850 were not the strongest. They were the ones the system happened to miss. The real question 1850 leaves you with is not about the past at all. It is about now. Because every era is absolutely certain that its medicine is correct. Its systems are rational, and its blind spots don't exist. The doctors who killed their patients with mercury and bloodletting were not evil. They were confident. And confidence, without the humility to question itself, has always been the most infectious thing in any room.